Chapter 3, Under the Yoke of Bolshevism. Coming straight from the turmoil of Supreme Headquarters in Mogilev, I was struck by the peaceful atmosphere in the Crimea. Since the outbreak of the revolution, many people had fled from the capital cities and taken refuge in the Crimea. Most of them were wealthy people with independent means who kept right out of politics. The Empress Mother and her daughters, the Grand Duchesses Xenia and Olga, and also the former Generalissimo, Grand Duke Nicholas, his brother, Grand Duke Peter, and Grand Duke Alexander, the Empress's son-in-law, were all living at Yalta. Many of our friends, too, were in the town or near it, and we often saw them. There was nothing for it but to lead a normal life. Only the news which reached us from time to time made us remember grim realities. Thus we heard of the horrible murder of Dukhonin, the last Generalissimo, and of Kornilov's escape from Baikov prison. We also received news of the Ukrainian Rada, which was leaning towards the left, and of the counter-revolution, which was said to be brewing in the neighborhood of the Don. I very much doubted if it could have spread this far so soon. On the contrary, it seemed more probable that the Cossacks would want to adopt communism, susceptible as they were to its charms. Our peaceful life did not last long. In Taurida, which had been quiet up till now, country mansions were being pillaged. One day I happened to be in the town of Melitopol, near our own estate, and there I saw Bolshevist soldiers and sailors for the first time. They were retreating after having been defeated at the mouth of the Don. They were like wild beasts rather than men. Armed to the teeth, they ill-treated and struck the railway officials, boarded the trains, and turned out the passengers, women, children, and all. The Crimea, like the Ukraine and the Don, wanted to organize itself as an independent state. A provisional Tatar government had been set up. As a garrison for the little towns of the peninsula, it had at its command an old regiment of Tartar dragoons, some companies of officers, and 2 field batteries. The garrison in Sebastopol had already gone red. The new Crimean government had ordered a general mobilization. They requested me to become commander-in-chief of this army. Before giving my answer, I went to Simferopol to find out if this new government had any justification for its existence, and if it was likely to be stable. On investigation, I found it to be a bad imitation of Kerensky's new government, so I refused the honor and went back to Yalta. On the morning of January 8, 1918, we learnt that during the night a skirmish had taken place between 2 of the Tartar squadrons and some Reds. The dragoons had retired to the mountains, the Reds had taken possession of the town, and the Soviet Republic was proclaimed the same day. The residents were commanded to give up their aims. A torpedo boat manned by Red sailors arrived at Sebastopol, and domiciliary searches began. A gang of these ruffians came to search out house without any kind of a warrant. I let them get on with it and went on playing with my 6-year-old son, taking not the slightest notice of their movements. They did their utmost to make me lose my temper. Seeing that they could not do so, they went away. Since then, I have often used this method and found it effective. On January 11th, I was awakened by the sound of firing. The dragoons had come back from the mountains and were occupying a part of the town. I went out onto the balcony, where my brother-in-law, a former captain of hussars, joined me. The firing was in full swing, and soon the guns boomed out. 2 shells fell in our garden. At midday, I was informed that half a platoon of Reds was stationed near our terrace. I went out to them. "Which of you is in charge?" "I am," said a sailor. "Good. Let me tell you that I am a general, and this gentleman is a captain. Understand that we are not hiding." "We are only fighting against Tartars," said another. "The poor beggars belong to the age of Catherine the Great. They have sworn allegiance to Russia, and now they want to be independent." Many times since then, I have thought of those words, spoken by an anti-nationalist and a conscious disciple of the International. Towards evening, the dragoons drew off. At dawn, I heard sounds of smashing doors, trampling feet, and shouting. My door opened, several men dashed towards my bed, and a little spotty-faced sailor pointed his revolver at my heart. "Don't move, I arrest you." "Send your men away," I said to him. "You can see that I am alone and unarmed. I will get dressed, and then I'll follow you." I dressed quickly, and we went out of the room. Our servants were weeping. My brother-in-law was also arrested. In the courtyard, amongst about 15 sailors, I saw one of our gardeners whom I had recently taken by the scruff of his neck and thrown out of the house because he had insulted my wife. I learnt later that he had been responsible for bringing the party along. The wretch shouted, "I swear that this man is a general and has been backing up the Tartars. He is the people's enemy and a counter-revolutionary." We were hooted by the crowd of idlers which had collected in the street. Then a Greek said, "I swear that they are innocent and took no part at all in the battle. I live only a stone's throw from here." "That's all right, we will see about it," a sailor said to him. 2 cars were waiting. We got into one of them, and at the same moment my wife rushed out and hung on to the door. I implored her to go back to the house, and the sailors pushed her off, but she stood there weeping and begged to be allowed to get into the car. "If she goes, so much the worse for her," said a sailor. "Let her go." She leapt into the car, and we were off. We reached the pier, which was crowded with people. A torpedo boat was moored there. As soon as the crowd saw us, they began to yell, "Look out! Here come the bloodsuckers! To the water with them! To the water!" I saw several corpses, all covered with blood, but we were safely on the bridge of the torpedo boat. We were made to go below into a cabin. One sailor remained on guard outside. The others went back to the bridge. A naval officer appeared. He looked pale and worn out, a pitiable object. My wife darted over to him. "What are you going to do?" "Do not be alarmed, madame. If you are innocent, you will get out of this. I am the captain, but unfortunately I can do nothing." More sailors appeared bawling, "Let's have these scoundrels! To the water! To the water!" The captain, supported by a few men, succeeded in persuading them, after a great deal of trouble, that the Revolutionary Tribunal ought to deal with us. At last, they went away. Another prisoner was brought in, a colonel of engineers. The worthy fellow was very anxious, not for his own fate, but because he had some money belonging to his men at his own home, and you realize what a fuss they will make if this money is lost. I have seen death at close quarters many a time, and I am not afraid of it. But the idea of dying at the hands of Russian soldiers, of being shot like a spy or a common thief before the eyes of my wife, was horrible to me. Therefore I did all I could to induce her to go back to our children. Besides, you can be of more use to me in the town than here. Tell our servants to come and bear witness to my innocence." This decided her. She was given permission to go. But I spoilt everything. I felt that I should never see her again, so I gave her back the watch bracelet she had given me, which I always wore. She went away in tears, and then I saw her coming back. "I realize from this bracelet that you believe you are going to die." As the poor woman had started off, she had seen the crowd tear an officer to pieces. The colonel of engineers was set free, but he also was soon back. He returned to retrieve a pocketbook which had been taken from him. Naturally, he was unsuccessful. As he was starting off again, he whispered to us that the workmen from his woodyard had come to rescue him, and that there was quite a large crowd there, demanding that we too should be set free. At nightfall, we were made to leave the ship and were cooped up in the customs house, which was already full of prisoners. It was dirty and windowless and almost unfurnished. The floor was filthy and much spat upon. Our companions in misfortune were of all social grades. There were generals, young officers, students, schoolboy Tartars, and common loafers. The hall was full of sailors and Red Guards. We could hear their obscene swearing. Although everybody lay down on the floor in the end, in spite of their disgust at its filthy condition, nobody slept. We spoke in whispers and listened to our neighbors sighing. The examination lasted the whole night. A long-haired, untidy little student played the part of police magistrate. My turn came at last. After the formal questions as to my name, age, civil position, etc., he asked me, "Do you plead guilty?" "To what? Why have you been arrested?" "I was just going to ask you that, but I can see that you do not know either. I can guess the cause of my arrest." And I told him the incident of the gardener, adding, "I do not know if you are a married man, but I suppose, if you are, you would have done the same as I did." He passed on to another prisoner. It went on all through the night and into the next day when fresh prisoners appeared. Some people we knew very well were of the number. There was young Prince Mekchersky, an old retired General Yartsev, an octogenarian who could scarcely walk. About 8 o'clock in the evening, a tall, fair, good-looking sailor with an intelligent face came into our prison. Several men were with him, including the student who had examined us the night before, and the commissioner who I had seen on the torpedo boat. "That's Comrade Vakula, president of the tribunal," said one of our warders. "He is going to examine you immediately." The revolutionary tribunal passed from one prisoner to another. We watched old General Yartsev, Prince Mekchersky, a student, and some others being led away. Comrade Vakula came up to us. I heard the student who had examined me whisper to the president, "This is the one I told you about." "Why were you arrested?" he asked me. "Probably because I am a Russian general. It is the only crime of which I am guilty." "Why are you not wearing the decorated uniform which you were probably flaunting yesterday?" And without waiting for an answer, he turned to my wife. "And why were you arrested?" "I was not arrested. I am here of my own free will." He feigned surprise. "Then why are you here?" "I have always lived happily with my husband, and I want to stay with him until the end." Vakula, enjoying the theatrical effect in advance, glanced rapidly at the prisoners who were all about us. "Such women are not to be found every day. You owe your life to your wife. Go!" And with an emphatic gesture he pointed to the door. But we were kept there for another terrible night. The convicted prisoners were shot at the very door of the prison, and then bodies were thrown into the water. I learnt later that more than 100 people were executed, including young Mekchersky and old General Yartsev. Once the Reds were masters of the Crimea, the terror began in Simferopol, Upatona, and Yalta. More than 1,000 men, officers for the most part, were shot or massacred and thrown into the sea. Domiciliary visits were the order of the day, and money, jewels, and clothing were taken away. Fortunately, all this was done without any system. The residents were obliged to declare their wealth and to pay a contribution proportional to it. My mother-in-law, who was on the list as one of the chief contributors, declared that she possessed absolutely nothing and could not pay. She was threatened with imprisonment. She stuck to her point and never paid a halfpenny. Countess Tolstoy conscientiously gave the amount of her fortune and sold her jewels, keeping nothing but a few trifles. Her maid denounced her, and she and her daughter were imprisoned. They searched my house many times, but they found nothing at all. The jewels and money were hidden in the stomachs and heads of my little daughter's dolls, the furs and laces under a heap of charcoal. Far from denouncing us, my old servants even helped us to deceive the Red Bloodhounds. We probably owed our safety to them, because on the day of our arrest, they, together with some poor people my wife had helped, had come to demand our release. A decree was passed forbidding anyone to draw out more than 100 rubles from his current account. It was impossible to keep a large family on this amount. Our servants complained many times to the commissar that they had not been paid for months and claimed their due. The bank was ordered to pay the proletariat their wages, deducting the sum from our current account. And our loyal proletariat brought to their oppressors eager for their blood the money which after great trouble they had succeeded in wringing from the grasping bourgeois. On more than one night we were forced to go and seek a lodging in a distant part of the town. Everybody stayed indoors and avoided showing themselves in the streets. Provisions became increasingly scarce, life more and more impossible. We left the town, taking with us those of our servants whom we could trust, and went to live in a flat on the outskirts of Miskor, where the Reds seldom came. My wife had succeeded in getting me a permit to reside there, on which I was described not as a general, but as a certified engineer. Our neighbors were Tartars, sworn enemies of the Reds, and most of them were Mahometans. They used to warn us of the slightest danger which threatened us. We lived like this for about 3 months. Then we heard a rumor that the Germans were in the Ukraine. We saw less and less of the Reds, and one fine morning, we saw a column of Prussian soldiers on the highway, marching in good order. Deeply grieved as I was to see the enemy master of Russia and my country disgraced, I was nevertheless happy at being free from the humiliating yoke of those block-headed idiots. 2. In the Ukraine and White Russia, I must give the Germans their due. They behaved with decency and did their best to avoid annoying the inhabitants of the country they were about to occupy. All the decrees and orders of their predecessors were annulled, except the one concerning permission to leave or enter the Crimea. The Kommandator helped those who had been lobbed to get their possessions back again, and had those red thieves and murderers who had not been able to get clear in time arrested and delivered up to justice. The only Bolshevists to whom they gave a helping hand were the leaders, and these they enabled to return to Moscow safe and sound. The day after the troops arrived, delegates from the German command presented themselves at Dulber Castle, where all the members of the imperial family were in residence, and requested Grand Duke Nicholas to receive them. The Grand Duke sent his answer by his aide-de-camp. If he was to consider himself as a prisoner of war, he believed that he was forced to obey, but if their visit was one of courtesy only, he found it impossible to receive them. The Prussian officers replied that they quite appreciated His Imperial Highness's answer, and that they were at his service and ready to put a bodyguard at his disposal. The Grand Duke refused on the score that the handful of Russian soldiers who were with him were quite sufficient. Life at Yalta resumed its normal course. The Empress Mother came over nearly every day to see her old friend, Princess Dolgoroki, and they would sit on a seat on the beach for hours at a time. Grand Duke Nicholas was the only one who shut himself up in the house. I made up my mind to go and inspect an estate we had in Lithuania, and as Kiev was on the way, I decided to stop and see Skoropadsky, who had just been proclaimed Hetman, Chief of State, of the Ukraine. We were old friends, had served in the same brigade when we were young officers, and had later gone through the Russo-Japanese War together. At the beginning of the World War, he had been a colonel in the Horse Guards, and I had been a major. After a few months, he had risen to the rank of Major General, and I had been his Chief of Staff. Now I was curious to see him at work. Kiev, the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy, was now transformed into the ancient capital of the Ukraine and the town of residence of the new Hetman. But it had changed very little. The people continued to speak Russian, although the signboards and street names were written up in a dialect which neither the Russians nor the Little Russians understood. The Hetman had given instructions that the official language was to be the Ukrainian tongue. The best of the thing was that the Hetman, although of Little Russian descent, could understand neither the Little Russian language nor his own native tongue, the so-called Ukrainian. Skoropadsky's first words were, "I am relying on you. Would you like to be my chief of staff? We will soon have a powerful Ukrainian army." I answered that since I had no stake in the Ukraine and knew nothing about local conditions, it would not be right for me to occupy the position. The two of us talked at great length. I was sure that the World War, which was still going on, would end in the defeat of Germany, and that the Germans, who were supporting the Hetman, would be forced to evacuate Russia. Once this happened, the Hetman's government would fall, and furthermore, since Germany was lending her support for purely selfish reasons, she would never tolerate the formation of a strong Ukrainian army. Skoropadsky, however, held very firmly to the contrary opinion. According to him, the Ukraine, supported by Austria and the Slav countries, would become very powerful and play a leading part in the future. We returned to this question many times. I discussed it with people who were familiar with the situation, and in the end I was convinced that Skoropadsky was not sincere in his venture. Therefore, I turned down all his proposals. Kiev was packed full of officers who had escaped death by some miracle. Almost the whole of my 7th Division was there too. As I have already said, I had not been in at the final breakdown of the army and had only seen the beginning. I learned from them how things had gone since I had left them. They told me of the outrages they had had to endure and of the life of martyrdom they had led. Most of the officers had been loyal to their duty and their colors until the last, and had been present at the dissolution of their regiments and the collapse of the army. They had watched the final exhaustion of the worthy fellows with whom they had lived like brothers for years, sharing their joys and sorrows, men who, at their command, had faced death unflinchingly. And now these last fragments of the great Russian army had met at Kiev at the risk of their lives. Some had come on foot, others by railway, and all had been hounded about like wild animals. Some hoped to go on fighting for Russia under the Ukrainian flag, others to get to the region of the Don, where the Cossacks had renounced Bolshevism and elected the Tsarist General Krasnov as ataman. The rest intended to join the volunteer army, which it was said was in course of formation. The names of Generals Alexeyev, Kornilov, and Denikin were enough to create the belief that the undertaking was a serious one. The flag was certainly in good hands, but there was neither ammunition, arms, nor money. The section of the population from which this new army should have been formed had not yet made up its mind. Were we justified in putting our faith in an undertaking which had such a slight chance of success? General Svechin had recently arrived from the Don. He was very well informed as to the situation and caused me much distress. I heard from him that Krasnov, who had been appointed ataman, was doing everything in his power to hasten the resurrection of the army, but that the Cossacks, who were more chauvinistic than ever, refused to have officers in their regiments if they were not Cossacks by birth. After Kornilov's death and his defeat at the Kuban, it was hardly possible that the reorganization of the army should go on, especially as it was rumored that the generals were far from being in agreement with one another. Several days later, I heard that a delegation from the Soviet government had just come to Kiev to propose some sort of alliance between the ruler of the Ukraine and the Republic of Workmen and Peasants. It was led by the former Brigadier General of the 7th Division, Odintsov, of whom I have spoken before, and who had been one of the first to join the Red ranks. One fine day, my door opened to admit this gentleman, who came in smiling and with outstretched hand. "What a pleasure to see you again. I heard that you had been killed. I hope you are well." I got up without shaking hands with him. "Yes, thank you. I won't ask how you are, because I know that you are doing very well in the service of your new masters." Odintsov interrupted me. "Every man has a right to a hearing before he is judged. I don't care a damn for public opinion, but I do value that of men I like and respect. You must hear what I have to say." "I am listening." "I have sacrificed myself for my country. I have given more than my life, for I have sacrificed my honor." "Excuse my interrupting you, but I don't quite follow. You are saying that you sacrificed your honor and went over to the Bolsheviks for the good of your country?" "Yes, I am a monarchist, but to achieve monarchy, we must go through anarchy and serve the Bolshevists that we may overthrow them." "And you think you can work with Trotsky, who is the paid representative of our enemies? I suppose you realize that he is a German spy?" "He is not the only one, but there's a topsy-turvy scale of values in politics, and ends justify means." I opened the door. "If that is all you have got to say to me, please get out." I will not say much more about my short stay in White Russia. The Germans were in occupation there too, and their discipline was much severer here than in the Crimea. The day after my arrival, Lieutenant Onemuller, the commanding officer of the platoon, which was quartered on us, presented himself to me. He was a young man of good family, intelligent, cultured, and very well bred. He noticed my setters and asked me if I went in for shooting and if I expected to get any here. I told him I had hoped for some, but that it was impossible, as cartridges had been forbidden. The next day, he brought me some cartridges. We went out shooting together more than once. I have never been able to understand those chauvinists who regard as an enemy every man belonging to the nation with which his country is at war. You fight your enemy's army, but you can respect the individuals who compose it. I heard that a white army was being formed in the Don and in Caucasia, so I set out for Kiev again. At Kiev, I received confirmation of the news. One of my friends had just had a letter from Alexeyev himself. The Allies had promised arms and money. I hurried back to Yalta, where I gave my children into the care of their grandmother, after which I set out for Rostov on the Don, accompanied by my wife, who wanted to go on nursing the wounded as she had done during the Great War. The very same day, 4 years earlier, I had left the capital at the head of my squadron of horse guards to go and fight the Germans. The town had been decked with flags, bands had played the national anthem, and the people had cheered the Tsar and his troops wildly. Today, this same people had vilely assassinated the man whom they had then cheered and had deluged in fire and blood the country for which they had then been so ready to fight. The army had murdered its officers and destroyed itself. Nearly all my comrades who had marched off with me then had died on the battlefield. Those who had survived had had to hide themselves like criminals so that they might be faithful to their duty and rejoin the old flag. They had sought to obtain permits from the German authorities on false pretenses so that they could continue the struggle for their honor, their freedom, and their country. And to think that Russian men, their own comrades of former days, were trampling this freedom and honor underfoot. It is true that the enemy had brought things to this pass with agents and gold. Germany had failed to conquer by force of arms, but had succeeded in corrupting her enemy. It is maintained that everything is fair in war. Bernhardi says it. I admit it. But there are ways and ways, some honorable, some base. Quite often the end justifies the means, but the nation which uses unworthy means always gets a bad reputation. The grim shadow of civil war fell over Russia,